The day I realized my wife had betrayed me started off like any other, except for the part where I accidentally set our toaster on fire. In my defense, it wasn't entirely my fault. The thing had been on its last legs for months, and Elizabeth had been telling me to replace it, which, of course, meant I had stubbornly refused to do so out of principle. This morning, however, the universe decided to punish me for my cheapness. The toaster made a dramatic sizzling noise, followed by a tiny flame licking up the side of my already burned bagel. I stared at it, contemplating whether to take action or just let fate handle it. That's when Elizabeth walked into the kitchen, dressed in a crisp blue blouse that I was fairly certain she had never worn around me before. "John," she sighed, looking at the flaming toaster as if I were a 5-year-old who had just tried to microwave a spoon. "I like my breakfast crispy," I said, grabbing a dish towel to smother the flames. It worked, though the kitchen now smelled like regret. She rolled her eyes and poured herself a cup of coffee. No smile, no amused shake of the head, just a barely concealed irritation, like she had something better to do than witness my slow descent into household incompetence. Elizabeth had always been a morning person, the type who could wake up at 6, go for a run, and return looking fresh-faced and victorious while I was still debating whether getting out of bed was worth it. But recently, she had stopped making coffee at home, claiming the one at her office was better. She had also started wearing perfume, which I wasn't allowed to mention, and had a sudden, inexplicable interest in podcasts about mindfulness. I didn't comment on any of that. I simply sat at the table, poking at the remains of my bagel while she scrolled through her phone with the kind of focus people usually reserved for hostage negotiations. "You're working late again today?" I asked casually, keeping my voice neutral. She hesitated, just for a second. It was quick. So quick that someone who hadn't spent the last 8 years studying her face might have missed it. "Yeah," she said, flipping her phone face down. "Big project at work." I nodded slowly, taking a sip of my coffee. It tasted exactly like our marriage lately, lukewarm and slightly bitter. She left soon after, grabbing her bag and tossing a distracted, "Bye, love you," over her shoulder in a tone that sounded suspiciously like how someone might say, "See you later," to their dentist. I sat there for a while, staring at the toaster, wondering if I was reading too much into things. Spoiler alert, I wasn't. The moment everything truly unraveled wasn't some dramatic showdown or a suspicious credit card charge. No, it all started with a misplaced receipt. Not even an exciting one, like for some ridiculously expensive restaurant or a trip to Paris. No, this was a receipt for a hardware store. A perfectly normal, painfully boring receipt from a place called Grant's Home Improvement, which I found wedged under a pile of mail on our kitchen counter. Now, I'm not an investigative genius, but I am a man who has spent the last 3 months listening to his wife complain that our sink was leaking. So, naturally, I was intrigued. See, Elizabeth was many things: organized, decisive, really good at pretending to listen to my stories about office politics, but she was not a woman who knew her way around a wrench. If she had suddenly taken an interest in home repairs, that meant one of two things. She had finally cracked under the stress of her new mindfulness lifestyle and was planning to fix things herself in some sort of over-ambitious self-improvement project. Someone else had fixed it for her. And given the fact that our sink was still dripping like a passive-aggressive metronome, I had a strong feeling it wasn't option one. I picked up the receipt and studied it. The purchase had been made last Tuesday when she was supposedly at work late. Some guy named Tom had rung it up. I had never heard of a Tom. I put the receipt down, then picked it up again, because my brain refused to let it go. My rational side told me that it was probably nothing. But my gut, the same gut that had warned me not to buy that cheap toaster, told me that something was very, very wrong. Most people, when faced with potential betrayal, go through a series of complicated emotions: denial, anger, sadness. Me? I went to Grant's Home Improvement. It wasn't even a conscious decision. One minute, I was sitting on our couch, debating whether I was going insane, and the next, I was in my car, pulling into a parking lot that smelled like lumber and misplaced masculinity. The store was exactly what you'd expect. Aisles full of tools I didn't know how to use and employees who looked like they could build a house from scratch using nothing but sheer willpower. I wandered for a bit, trying to look casual, until I found the registers. And there he was. Tom. Tall, broad shoulders, the kind of guy who probably spent his weekends chopping wood for fun. I walked up to the counter, holding the receipt like some kind of confused detective. "Hey," I said, clearing my throat. "I think my wife bought something here last week." Tom glanced at the receipt, then at me. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. And that's when I knew. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't gasp or break down and confess to some grand affair. No, it was just that half-second of recognition, the moment of hesitation before he schooled his face into polite customer service neutrality. I don't really remember, he said, scratching his jaw. We get a lot of customers. Sure, I said, nodding. Of course. And then, just because I couldn't help myself, I added, you don't happen to moonlight as a plumber, do you? That did it. His fingers twitched. Just barely. But enough. I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I had my answer. Tom wasn't a plumber. Tom was the guy who had been fixing things for my wife. And suddenly, the broken toaster didn't seem like such a big problem anymore. Elizabeth was cheating on me with a guy who sold plywood. That was my life now. Some men find out their wives are having affairs with their bosses, or old college sweethearts, or guys named Chad who owned boats. But no, not me. My wife had chosen Tom, the Home Depot knockoff version of a leading man. I should have been furious, maybe even devastated. Instead, I mostly just felt insulted. If you're going to cheat, at least have the decency to do it with someone who's impressive. Someone I could shake my head at and begrudgingly say, well, I get it. A surgeon. A musician. A guy who builds rocket ships. But Elizabeth? No, she went straight for the guy who knew the difference between semi-gloss and satin finish. I left Grant's Home Improvement without buying anything, because I wasn't about to give that store any of my hard-earned money. Not after what it had taken from me. I drove home in complete silence, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, feeling like I had just been hit with a revelation so stupid that my brain refused to process it. Back at the house, I sat down on the couch and tried to piece it all together. Elizabeth had been acting strange for months. That part one already knew. But now, with the missing puzzle piece in place, all the other little things started making sense. Like how she suddenly had opinions about light fixtures. Elizabeth, the woman who once argued that all bulbs were the same and that lighting is just lighting, had spent an entire afternoon last month ranting about recessed lighting like she was some kind of interior design guru. She had shown me pictures of different fixtures on her phone, asking which one I liked, only to sigh when I gave the wrong answer. Or the fact that she had started throwing out my old tools. No, I am not a handyman. I know that about myself, and I've made peace with it. But I did own a toolbox. A perfectly respectable, slightly rusted toolbox filled with things I used once a year when something needed to be nailed or tightened. And yet, a few weeks ago, I had found my old hammer mysteriously missing. When I asked Elizabeth about it, she had shrugged and said, "You never use it anyway." And then there was the sink. It had been broken for 3 months. 3 months. And I had ignored it, because I believed in the ancient tradition of procrastination. But now, with the receipt from Tom the hardware homewrecker, I was willing to bet it had gotten magically fixed one day while I was out. So, I did what any man in my position would do. I got up, walked to the sink, and turned it on. No leak. I turned it off. Turned it on again. Still, no leak. And just like that, I had my answer. I leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene from a movie where the betrayed husband falls to his knees in agony. No, it was just me, standing in my own kitchen, realizing that my wife had managed to commit infidelity and solve a plumbing issue at the same time. Honestly, that was impressive. The front door opened. I turned just in time to see Elizabeth walk in, carrying a bag of groceries. She set them on the counter like she hadn't just completely shattered the foundation of our marriage with a man who knew the price of drywall. "Hey," she said, giving me a quick glance. "You're home early." I had nothing but time now, apparently. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice even. She nodded, pulling items from the bag. Bread. Vegetables. Something wrapped in butcher paper. A woman going about her day as if nothing had changed. I waited for her to say something. Maybe a guilty shift in her eyes. Maybe a nervous laugh. But nope, she was cool as ever, like she wasn't carrying around a massive secret. And I just stood there, watching her, trying to figure out what to do next. Because now that I knew the truth, I had a decision to make. Elizabeth was unpacking groceries while I stood there, staring at her like I had just discovered my toaster was part of an underground crime syndicate. I wasn't sure what I had expected. Maybe some kind of sudden confession. A guilty twitch. Hey, by the way, John, I've been seeing Tom from the hardware store behind your back, and I figured you'd appreciate my honesty. But nope. Nothing. She reached into the bag and pulled out a roll of paper towels, stacking it neatly in the cabinet. like a woman with nothing to hide, like someone who had not, in fact, committed a betrayal so insultingly suburban that it belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So, how was work? Elizabeth didn't even look up. Fine. Busy. Busy. Sure. I didn't respond, just watched her place a carton of eggs into the fridge like she was on a cooking show. You okay? She asked finally, closing the fridge and turning to me. Yeah, I said, too quickly. Just thinking. About what? About how my wife has apparently been engaged in an illicit romance with a man whose primary skill set involves cutting keys and selling paint swatches. Nothing important, I said instead. She nodded, grabbing a receipt from the counter and glancing at it before shoving it into her purse. Normally, that kind of behavior wouldn't register as anything. But today, I was looking at everything differently. Hey, I said casually, did you ever get the sink fixed? Elizabeth blinked. It was small, barely noticeable, but I caught it. A hesitation. No, she said. Still broken. Liar. I nodded like I believed her. She was good. I had to give her credit. No panic. No guilt-ridden rambling. Just smooth, practiced deceit. It almost made me wonder how long she had been at this. How many other things had she lied about? Did she even really hate pineapple on pizza? Or was that another carefully crafted deception? I needed more. Something solid. The receipt had pointed me in the right direction, but I wasn't about to confront her with half-baked accusations that she could wiggle her way out of. So, I did what any rational, betrayed husband would do. I waited for her to leave the room, then checked her car. Look, I know how that sounds. But desperate times, desperate measures. Her car was parked in the driveway, locked, because Elizabeth had the foresight to think about security, but unfortunately for her, I had lived with her long enough to know that she kept a spare key in the flower pot on the porch. I grabbed it, opened the driver's side door, and slid in. The car smelled like vanilla, which, for some reason, annoyed me. What was so innocent about vanilla? It was too soft, too sweet, like it was mocking me. I checked the glove compartment first. Receipts, old napkins, a pack of gum, nothing groundbreaking. Then the center console, more of the same. And then, finally, the sun visor. Bingo, a business card, Grant's Home Improvement, with a number, and a handwritten note in blue ink. Wednesday 3 p.m., meet in the back. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling a mix of triumph and utter humiliation. She was fool enough to leave this here, but I was fool enough to never suspect anything until now. The back of what? The store? The parking lot? Were they meeting behind the grill section like some kind of secret lover's rendezvous between the seasonal lawn chairs? I let out a sharp exhale, slipping the card into my pocket. This was it. This was the moment where I officially had to do something. So, I climbed out of the car, locked it, put the key back in the flower pot, and went inside like nothing had happened. Elizabeth was in the living room, watching something on TV. Probably a show about renovations, because apparently that was her new area of expertise. I sat down next to her, staring at the screen without really seeing it. Wednesday, 3 p.m. I was going to be there. Elizabeth walked into the house at 6:43 p.m. I know this because I was sitting on the couch, watching the clock, waiting for her like I was an overworked manager about to conduct the worst employee performance review of all time. She didn't speak right away. Just stood there in the doorway, eyes darting around like she was checking for hidden landmines. Maybe she had seen the flyers. Maybe someone from the neighborhood had texted her. Maybe she had gotten back in her car, glanced at her side mirror, and noticed the one I had taped to the stop sign directly outside our house. It didn't matter. She was cornered. You had a good day? I asked, all casual, like I wasn't the one who had spent the last few hours personally ensuring her social life would crumble faster than an expired granola bar. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. John, what did you do? I leaned back, stretched my arms, cracked my knuckles for dramatic effect. I don't know what you mean. What did I do? Her lips pressed into a thin line. The flyers. Oh, those. I waved a dismissive hand. Neighborhood PSA. Thought people should know about the fine selection of local home improvement services you've been enjoying. She inhaled sharply. You are unbelievable. Tom probably thinks so too. Her face turned red. Not embarrassed red. Furious red. The kind of red that said she was about to start throwing things, except she knew that would make her look even more guilty. You humiliated me, she hissed. Oh, trust me, Liz, you did that all by yourself. She ran a hand through her hair, exhaling through her nose. I could see her brain working, trying to calculate the best way to flip this around, regain control. And then she did the thing. The thing all guilty people do when they have no way out. She switched tactics. "I can't believe you would destroy our marriage like this," she said, voice shaking just the right amount. Not too much. Just enough to make it seem like I was the unreasonable one. "You didn't even talk to me. She motioned vaguely toward the door. "Went nuclear." I let out a laugh, sharp and humorless. "Destroy our marriage?" "Elizabeth, you were hooking up with a guy in a storage unit next to somebody's Christmas decorations. Don't stand there and act like I'm the one who crossed a line." That shut her up for a second. Then she squared her shoulders. And that's when I knew. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to beg. She was going to fight. And she was going to make it ugly. "You want to play games, John?" she said, voice cold now. "Fine. Let's play." The first shot came 3 days later. A lawyer's letter. Official. Fancy. Delivered straight to the house like a ticking time bomb in a manila envelope. Elizabeth wanted a divorce. But not just any divorce. A scorched earth divorce. She was coming for everything. The house. The car. The savings account. My retirement fund, which she had contributed exactly $0 to, unless you count the time she let me use her credit card points to buy an air fryer. She wanted half of everything I owned, plus spousal support, plus the satisfaction of knowing I would be financially wrecked by the time she was done with me. It was almost impressive. I sat at the kitchen table, reading the paperwork, wondering if I had accidentally married a James Bond villain. The best part? She had zero legal grounds for any of it. We had no kids. No joint debts. We both worked full-time jobs, which meant there was no reason I should be giving her a single dime. But here's the thing about people like Elizabeth. It wasn't about what she could actually win. It was about making my life miserable. And if she couldn't take everything, she'd make sure I bled money trying to fight her. The second attack came in the form of my car. Or, more specifically, the fact that it was mysteriously towed while I was at work. I came out of the office, keys in hand, only to find an empty parking space where my car should have been. I called the towing company, and after 30 minutes on hold, they finally explained that the vehicle had been reported as abandoned and illegally parked. By who? Well, they couldn't tell me that. But I had a pretty good guess. It took $450 and an hour-long argument with an underpaid employee to get my car back. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. The third shot was my job. I was halfway through a meeting when HR called me in. Elizabeth had filed a complaint. Apparently, I was an emotionally unstable spouse, and she was concerned for her safety. Now, legally, this meant nothing. I had never threatened her, never raised my voice in public, never done anything remotely close to what she was implying. But corporate HR? They don't care about truth. They care about liability. So, I got a friendly warning. A little, "Hey, just checking in. Everything good at home?" I smiled. Said, "Of course. My wife's just a bit emotional right now." Then I went back to my desk and started plotting. Because now, it was war. The problem with Elizabeth was that she thought she was smarter than me. Not just in a casual, "I'm better at word games" way, but in a deep, fundamental, "I'm always 10 steps ahead of you" kind of way. She had built our entire marriage on that assumption. That I was predictable, that I wouldn't see things coming, that I would react exactly how she expected. And maybe, for a while, she was right. But that was before she tried to rip my life apart like a raccoon going through a garbage can. Now, I was about to make sure her little war backfired spectacularly. It started with the house. Elizabeth was gunning for it, convinced that she could drag me through court and somehow walk away with full ownership. And maybe she thought I'd roll over, agree to a buyout, or best-case scenario for her, get stuck paying the mortgage while she lived rent-free, which was why I sold it. Not to her. Not to some random buyer. No, I sold it to my cousin Dan for exactly $1. Dan, a man who once got banned from a bowling alley for trying to grill hot dogs over the ball return machine. Dan, who had just gone through his own messy breakup and was thrilled at the idea of having a fresh place to start over. Legally, I still had access to the house, but now so did he. Which meant that when Elizabeth tried to pull up one day with her lawyer, she was greeted by Dan, sitting on the front porch in his bathrobe, drinking a beer and blasting country music loud enough to shake the windows. She lasted exactly 4 minutes before storming off. That was win number 1. Win number 2 came when she tried to freeze our joint bank account. She had planned it perfectly, wait until my paycheck hit, file some nonsense claim, and block my access so I'd be forced to negotiate with her. Unfortunately for her, I had already moved all my money out 2 weeks prior. All she managed to do was lock herself out of an account that now held a grand total of $16.32. The third and most satisfying win? Her job. Elizabeth had spent years cultivating the perfect professional reputation, polished, ambitious, respected. She was the type who always had a perfectly worded LinkedIn post ready to go, which was why it must have really stung when I sent an anonymous tip to her HR department, pointing out that she had been using company resources to help Tom with his little side business. Emails, spreadsheets, a few invoices she had conveniently sent during work hours. I didn't have to lie. I didn't have to fabricate anything. I just organized the truth in a nice, easy-to-read format and let corporate policy do the rest. She wasn't fired, not immediately. But the internal investigation meant she lost a major promotion she had been bragging about for months. And oh, the absolute joy of watching her try to pretend it wasn't eating her alive. The final move, the checkmate, came in court. Elizabeth showed up prepared for battle. Her lawyer had the whole act ready, paint me as unstable, irresponsible, a financial wreck. But there was one tiny problem. I had receipts. Not just the financial kind, either. Emails, texts, copies of her little business meetings with Tom. A list of every time she had worked late, while actually using our joint account to buy things for their little storage unit romance. By the time I was done, her lawyer looked like he wanted to melt into his chair. Elizabeth? She just sat there, seething, realizing she had lost. In the end, the judge gave her nothing. No house. No alimony. No easy payday. Just a very expensive legal bill and the joy of watching me walk out of that courtroom with everything she wanted for herself. The last time I saw Elizabeth, she was standing in the courthouse parking lot, phone in hand, probably trying to figure out her next move. She turned to me, opening her mouth like she was about to say something. Maybe an insult. Maybe some desperate attempt to rewrite history. But I didn't care. I just smiled, got in my car, and drove off, leaving her exactly where she belonged in the past. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel